Hello and welcome to another edition of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. I am here at the News Forum where all voices matter. I'm pleased to welcome back the monthly panel of political and economic experts. It's great to have you all with us. We've got the Honorable Gary Marr. He's decked out in his Calgary Stampede regalia, so that's fantastic. The Honorable Joe Oliver joins us as well. He's a former finance minister. Gary, by the way, is head of the Canada West Foundation. I should mention that. And of course, the Honorable Senator Sandra Pupatello comes to us from the Senate of Canada. Welcome to all of you.
Howdy.
Thank you.
Yeah. So obvious question is in the last few days, it's been evident that we're into a new phase of negotiations on Canada-U.S. trade. Maybe Sandra, I'll start with you for a change. It looks like the Cusma agreement has not been extended, which means it's on a year-to-year track. What has changed? What's your analysis of the situation?
I think for the people on the ground, all the companies, at least in Southern Ontario, that are largely automotive, nothing changed from the day before July 1st to today. And that's mostly because I think we would have been surprised if all of a sudden the president of the US said, oh, all right, let's just sign. I mean, we always anticipated that they want to get into the weeds on certain irritants that have not been resolved. So that's where we are. And I also noticed that the markets barely reacted to the fact that the American trade negotiator said, we don't want to just renew, we want to revisit these things. And the markets barely reacted. So we're kind of used to this being in limbo, and that's going to continue again for some time.
Joe, is this a big nothing burger then? Nothing really has changed?
Well, in one sense, nothing has changed, but it's not a nothing burger at all. I mean, we're talking here about, I think, $1.25 trillion of trade between our two countries, about $3.5 billion a day. And the fact that this trade agreement is not going to be renewed for the 16 years that we and the Mexican wanted is not a positive sign. But I agree certainly with Sandra that it's no surprise. I mean, it would have been a shocker if they had signed on, given what the president has been saying repeatedly, that he doesn't need anything that Canada or Mexico produces. Not entirely true, may I say. But the negative here is what impact it has on Canadian companies and their willingness to expand in Canada, to invest capital. We have a capital flight problem, and with the United States, if you don't want to call it capital flight, at least you have to acknowledge that there's perhaps $100 billion in annual capital outflow to the United States, and that impacts on our growth, on our GDP per capita, on employment, and it's clearly a negative for Canada and for Mexico that there's still uncertainty. The agreement will be automatically renewed every year unless it's canceled by any one of the parties with the 6 months notice. I don't think that's about to happen, but there's a lot of uncertainty as to what agreements actually will be arrived at and when. And there's a whole list, and we can get into that if you want, of irritants from the American perspective, and some asks or demands that make no sense. I mean, the big one that doesn't make sense is the one that they harp on a lot, or the president does, and that's that there's a trade deficit that the United States has with Canada, and it's about $85 billion. But it's entirely attributable to the oil, gas, and other energy that we sell to the United States at below international prices, without which we would have a serious trade deficit with the U.S., and they would have a comparable surplus. Now, the Americans don't want to stop buying our oil and gas and getting
Right.
our electricity because they're getting it at below international prices. So it's clearly advantageous to us, and the reason it's happening is in part because we haven't been able to export our oil to overseas markets because we don't
Right.
have the pipeline capacity to get to Tidewater.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Thanks for that, Joe. We're going to hear from Gary Marr. We're going to take a brief break first, and we'll be back with our guests after these messages. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, with our expert panel. We've got the Honorable Joe Oliver, the Honorable Gary Marr, the Honorable Sandra Pupatello, Senator Sandra Pupatello. Gary Marr, you are next. Your reaction to no extension of the trade deal and what it all means.
It's no surprise that there's no extension at this point, but I think it's worth noting that there are really two sets of negotiations that are going on. One is for Cusma, and the other is which covers the majority of exports that we send to Canada, send to the United States, which is tariff free. And then there are a group of exports that we have that are not part of Cusma. That would include auto parts, steel, aluminum, forestry products, softwood lumber. The Canadian government is working with the USTR on both of these areas. Both are important. For the time being, there's no change. And it remains to be seen whether or not we kick the can down the road, or whether the prime minister is able to make the case to the president that our economies are so integrated that while you will cause pain in Canada, so too will you cause pain in the United States. And the next interesting touch point will be the US midterm elections, to see if there are people who have the courage politically to stand up to the president and say, this nonsense of not wanting or needing all of these goods from Canada doesn't make sense to us, because about 80% of US electricity imports come from Canada. About 2/3 of their oil comes from Canada. Probably 30% of their steel and aluminum come from Canada. Potash, about 90% of the potash needed by farmers comes from Canada. Critical minerals, and the list goes on and on. So while the president may say we don't need your auto parts, the reality is a car moves back and forth across the border many, many times. And because they're integrated, you can't do without Canadian auto parts going back and forth across the border. And so I think that at some point, perhaps in the midterm election, somebody's going to point out this hard reality to the president. And he'll want to strike a deal like a businessman. He is not like a politician in any kind of conventional sense, but he will look for the best deal for the United States. And at the end of the day, whatever he settles upon, he needs to have the bumper sticker that says, I got us a great deal. And that's the perspective. We're dealing with a businessman. We're not really dealing with trade negotiations in the traditional sense. And perhaps the nature of our trade relationship with the United States will be forever changed by the manner in which the president is operating right now.
Sandra, please chime in on this, because I think we have to go. Where do we go to next is what Gary is talking about.
Well, and I like the notion, if we are able to drag it out past the midterm elections in the US, first, it's striking that in Canada, the Prime Minister himself could not do this. So we're not used to one individual in the US having this level of control over what happens on international trade deals. But that is their system. And some are even questioning how much authority he does have with this. But if the midterms do not go the Republican way, then half of the states that are wholly beholden to trade with Canada, they're half of them at least are Republican run. So I think they may change their tune in how aggressive they need to be with Washington about how important the Canadian trade relationship is. And the same is true with Mexico. So I think midterm elections could be a turning point depending on how they go. some of the shine is off the administration in Washington, and we've seen that over time. Somehow he's almost like a cat with nine lives, which someone will write a book about the fascination that the Americans have with this president. But nonetheless, the waiting game, Gary, you're right. The lion's share of the products that we're producing in Ontario, for example, are fitting under Cusma. But the hit that we're taking with our tool die mold sector, for example, steel, those tariffs are having a tremendous impact on both sides of the border. And that's why the length of time this goes on is important, because the American companies are also feeling the pain. And at some point, they're either gone bankrupt, or they will finally stand up and sort of speak truth to power, which I don't hear. I don't hear that in the least like we would hear it in Canada. The comparison to how companies talk to ministers in Canada is simply not being
Right.
replicated at this point in the US.
All right. Well, thank you for that, Sandra. Very, very interesting and important. Joe, you're going to get the floor after these commercial messages. And we're back here at Boom and Bust with our panel, the Honorable Senator Sandra Pupatello, the Honorable Gary Marr, and the Honorable Joe Oliver. Joe, where do we go from here with our trade relations with the United States? Is there a possibility of a deal, do you think?
Well, there is, because I think ultimately it's in the American interest, but that doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to do it. I mean, I recall when I was in office, and we were all hoping that President Obama would approve the Keystone XL, because not because it was so important to us, but because it was clearly in the American national interest. But he didn't, and politics overrode it. He was concerned about the movie stars and the climate alarmists in California, and he nixed the deal. So this president is unpredictable. But one of the things we know about him, he loves tariffs, and he's talked about it repeatedly. So the question is, what do we do about that? And I think listen, I'm not saying that they aren't doing it. We don't know exactly what they're doing, but I think we have to get active here. And the impression one has is the Mexicans have been out there more than we have, which is why their negotiation seems to be moving ahead at a more rapid rate. But look, there's some things that I think are important. He is a businessman, but there are national security issues as they see it, and certainly the border issues are one. The fentanyl and immigration is a concern. Chinese transshipments of goods that may be at lower prices or pose a national security risk is a very important issue from their perspective. And these are things that I think we can definitely move on, as we have to some degree on defense. But then there are other issues that are irritants for them, that we can also move on, that shouldn't be a big give, like opening up the wine, beer, and spirits market again. We're holding that back, but it's something that we ought to give on. You've heard my views many times on dairy supply management. That's a big irritation for them. It's a political problem for us, but it's not really an economic issue that we shouldn't want to compromise on, because we'd come out better if we did it. Digital services tax, that's something we can work on. But the sectoral tariffs on aluminum, steel, auto parts, softwood lumber. Those are some of the really contentious things that we're going to have to sit down and talk to them, and hope that their self-interest and the interest of their corporations will be enough of a boost to have them start opening up. I mean, it's not a guarantee, because they can do things that aren't necessarily in their ultimate self-interest. But But I think
Sure.
I think there's a hope. I haven't given up, but I'm certainly not predicting a major victory. I think it's going to be painful. It's going to
Hmm.
probably take a fair amount of time, and
Right.
in the meantime, we're losing and he's winning because Canadian companies are moving their plants to the United States to avoid the
Right.
tariffs and the uncertainty.
Sandra, do you think, I mean, you know the auto sector so well. Do you think the auto sector can survive all of this uncertainty?
Well, I do think it is a matter of time. They are absolutely sitting on investment right now and investment decisions. So we know we've watched that happen over the course of the last year, where plants are saying that they're just not moving forward on a particular product. We're reading that to be, worst case scenario. I know they're not shutting the plant, they're just holding back on an investment decision. And
Right.
that is going to be when Cusma is finally resolved. They'll know that the multi-billion-dollar investment is actually worth it. Or are they going to continue these tariffs on every vehicle made in Canada and Mexico, which is a problem? Our car parts go to Mexico and they go to America and they go into our own plants here. But interestingly, lately Trump has raised the specter of 50% of every vehicle being made of American parts.
Yeah.
That's almost where we're at today. So if we're going to sort of give on something, we're going to give on where we're almost at already. And
Right.
he may not realize how much of an American product is in every vehicle. And it
Okay.
leads me to believe that almost a Switzerland or third party verifier is what is
Sure.
absolutely required when we're getting into this.
I'm gonna,
Joe
I'm
mentioned.
gonna, yeah, I'm gonna have to cut you off. I'm sorry, we run out of time on this segment, Sandra, but we'll be back after these messages. Thank you. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I've got my wonderful expert panel here. Sandra, did you want to complete your point? I think I had to cut you off there.
Sure, just that the frustration for us becomes that I don't believe that the American president is operating with the facts when he's making a point about what his irritant is, for example, complaining about cheese or dairy products from Canada. They have rarely, if ever, actually met the quota that would ever kick in a tariff on dairy. So, I'm considering that we should have a third party that we all agree will lay the facts down and then operate from that point forward. And that would be, great. So you can actually talk about what actually goes into a car and from where, and what the impact on America is with tariffs on both sides. What is the real issue with dairy? Because
Right.
I worry that if all of a sudden we're going to just throw in the towel and open the doors wide, I'm really concerned that we've built standards in our food safety regime, for example, in Canada, and I want to see that's carried forward. So bring in your cheap product, but if your product is cheap, it better be meeting our standard. And I want it proved that it does, because that is one good reason why our food is more expensive in Canada. We pay for it. It's difficult, but at least we
Sure.
know that we've got a high level of food safety.
Gary Marr, you're obviously in Calgary. The Calgary Stampede is upon us. Yeah, you recently published an op-ed on how the Canada West Foundation would like to be helpful in the debate about the future of Alberta. Why don't you talk us through a little bit of that?
Well, there's been lots of people who have made comparisons between Alberta and the Brexit movement. And I think it's actually not an accurate comparison, because it's one thing to take an entire country out of a trading union. It's another thing to take a subnational jurisdiction outside of a country. And so this is more closely like the Scottish secession movement. And I think what happened in Scotland is that people had to look at the practical realities of creating their own central banking, their own defense system, their own set of diplomatic offices, their own currency. And Canada is a signatory to, I don't know, maybe 4,000, maybe 5,000 treaties and agreements. And as a consequence, the Canadian passport's accepted in over 100 countries without a visa. Is anybody going to accept an Alberta passport in the same manner?
Mm.
I mean, the answer is no. And so, what Canada West Foundation wants to do is we want to lay out the pros and the cons and the economic costs of an independent Alberta. We're not promoting one side or the other. In fact, I want to stay away from being partisan about this because as I've looked at the the leave and the stay groups, they've some of them have gone into what I call the Hillary Clinton trap, which is to demonize the other side. And Hillary Clinton's line, you'll recall, was about being opposed to gun-toting, church-going baskets of deplorables. And I think that the for and the leave and stay sides have descended into a bit of that kind of rhetoric. And we're there just to lay out the facts. We're there to lay out what are the issues that an independent Alberta would have to deal with. How do you deal with treaty obligations? How do you deal with your share of the debt? How do you deal with Canada Pension Plan? How do you deal with a whole host of issues? And what are the practical realities and costs of setting up your own diplomatic missions around the world? And that you cannot assume that Alberta, an independent Alberta, would simply be grandfathered in to the many obligations and benefits and advantages that Canada enjoys in other places around the world, whether it comes to trade or passports or acceptance of a currency. So, and I think it's there are parts of the province that are very much in favor of leaving Canada, and I understand their frustrations.
Sure.
But surely there must be a way that we can overcome those frustrations with policy solutions that can meet them. And to ignore them, I think we do so at our peril.